The first slide showed the 4 pillars of pandemic response. The first pillar is contagion control. And of course, we've done that with social distancing and economic shutdowns, masks, all those types of things. The second pillar is early home treatment. The third is late-stage hospital treatment. And the fourth is vaccination. If you want to put up the next slide. The second slide displayed the 3 stages of COVID, of the disease. The first stage is viral replication, the second, cytokine storm, and the third, microthrombosis. The goal of this hearing is identical to the goal of our first hearing, to discuss early treatment options that attack the disease in the first stage by limiting viral replication. Doing so would hopefully prevent progression to cytokine storm, microthrombosis, and possibly death. This is how Tamiflu works in limiting the severity of the flu. It is how we approach every other disease. Early detection allows for early treatment and better outcomes. Seems like a pretty common sense approach to me. Yet this is not how we've attacked COVID. Instead, we've impoverished millions by shutting down economies, poured billions of dollars into ventilator production and new drug and vaccine development, but spent virtually nothing on research and trials using existing drugs and nutraceuticals. In fact, there's been a concerted effort to block doctors who actually treat COVID patients from compassionately using their off-label prescription rights for early treatment protocols. Why? In his reflections on progress, peaceful coexistence, and intellectual freedom, Russian dissident Andrei Sakharov wrote, quote, "The second basic thesis is that intellectual freedom is essential to human society. Freedom to obtain and distribute information, freedom for open-minded and unfearing debate, and freedom from pressure by officialdom and prejudices. Such a trinity of freedom of thought is the only guarantee against an infection of people by mass myths, which, in the hands of treacherous hypocrites and demagogues, can be transformed into bloody dictatorship. Freedom of thought is the only guarantee of the feasibility of a scientific, democratic approach to politics, economics, and culture. In today's biased news media and social media, within academic journals, on college campuses, in government agencies and ivory towers, we are losing the freedom to obtain and distribute information. The reaction to our first hearing on early treatment is but one example. Although not surprising in today's hyper-partisan climate, it is still shocking. In that hearing, we heard from Dr. McCulloch, a cardiologist and vice chair of medicine at Baylor University Medical Center, Dr. Harvey Risch, senior professor of epidemiology at Yale University, and Dr. George Fareed, trained at Harvard University and the National Institutes of Health. Combined, these doctors have more than 900 scientific research publications, extensive drug development experience, more than 80 years clinical practice, including treating more than 1,000 high-risk COVID patients, along with thousands of other lower-risk COVID patients. I was hoping that, post-election, by asking such eminently qualified doctors to testify about the rationale for and growing effectiveness of early treatment, minds could be opened and lives could be saved. Unfortunately, the Democrat witness, Dr. Ashish Jha, began tweeting his negative viewpoint of early treatment before the hearing even began and continued his media blitz for days afterward. Most obnoxiously, and it was obnoxious, he penned an op-ed that the New York Times ran and headlined, quote, "The snake oil salesman of the Senate," unquote. The absurdity of calling Dr. Jha as a witness or paying any attention to him in the media was demonstrated when I asked him during the hearing, "Have you treated any COVID patients?" His reply, "I have not, sir." Dr. McCulloch also talked about the circle of empathy in medicine. Those who actually treat COVID patients are in the center. Not only have they shown extraordinary courage exposing themselves to the disease, they also have the greatest empathy for patients who experience the fear and loneliness of a COVID diagnosis. These are the medical practitioners, the heroes, that experts in the ivory towers and media have chosen to ignore and vilify. The experts far outside the circle of empathy have developed and supported the current NIH guideline of providing no treatment at all until patients are sick enough to require hospitalizations. As we are all aware, at that point, treatment is often too late. So here we are again, holding a second hearing to obtain and distribute information on what is known about early treatment of COVID. What could possibly be controversial about that? Yet some are calling this hearing dangerous. And instead of waiting until after the hearing to trash this information and our witnesses, the New York Times and other publications have already run preemptive attacks, implying this hearing is anti-vaccine. So let me be clear. This hearing, like the first hearing, is focused on early treatment of COVID. It is not about vaccines. End of story. In my opinion, discouraging and in some cases prohibiting the research and use of drugs that have been safely used for decades has cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people their lives. By the time any vaccine is fully deployed, no matter how successful, how effective, how safe, millions more will become infected. With effective early treatment, fewer people will get seriously ill and fewer people will die. So why not give early treatment a shot? What have we got to lose? And finally, why is there such a concerted effort to silence the voices of courageous health professionals promoting early treatment? It makes no sense. Let me make just a final point. At the beginning of this epidemic, when I first heard about the potential of hydroxychloroquine, it intrigued me because, to me, a drug like that, that's been around for 65 years, shown to be safe, it's cheap, billions of tablets are produced every year. We could have ramped up production. If that could be proven to be effective, wouldn't that be the dream solution? Why didn't we pursue that in ivermectin and favipiravir? Why didn't we look at these drugs that were already there, generic, cheap, mass-producible? Again, it makes no sense. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation continues to battle a worsening public health and economic crisis that has taken the lives of nearly 284,000 Americans. Over 2,200 Americans are dying every day from this deadly virus. And thanks to the tireless work of our public health agencies, the private sector, and our scientific and medical communities, we've made progress in treating this disease. The Food and Drug Administration continues to use scientific standards to authorize innovative and effective early treatments. Unfortunately, today's discussion will not meet those same standards. Mr. Chairman, I certainly share your goal of ensuring patients across the country have access to early and effective treatments for coronavirus. But those statements must be based on evidence and not on politics. The American people are looking to Congress for accurate information, for leadership, and for relief. Last month, this committee held a hearing that was billed as a review of early outpatient treatments for coronavirus. Unfortunately, that hearing amplified unverified theories about treatments that are not supported by the scientific community. Instead of hearing from expert witnesses about scientific developments in the coronavirus treatments or how we can improve the pandemic response, the committee was used as a platform to attack science and promote discredited treatments. The minority witness, an expert in his field, was subjected to personal attacks from other witnesses and from this dais. After testifying, he faced an online harassment campaign unlike anything he had ever experienced in any prior congressional testimony. This behavior damages the credibility of this committee and does nothing to advance the health and the safety of the American people. Sadly, it appears that today's hearing is going to follow the same path playing politics with public health, and will not give us the information that we need to take on this crisis. The minority was not consulted about the scope of this hearing before it was noticed. The panelists have been selected for their political, not their medical views, and for that reason, the composition of the panel creates a false and terribly harmful impression of the scientific and medical consensus. The witnesses have made many harmful inflammatory statements. Those statements include undermining a COVID-19 vaccine, promoting unproven therapeutics, discouraging common sense measures to stop the spread of the virus like social distancing and masks, and even comparing physicians who support these interventions to supporters of a Nazi regime. Now, I certainly welcome diverse perspectives, but we have a responsibility to follow science, to follow facts, not conspiracy theories, and not disinformation. To that end, I'd like to enter, Mr. Chairman, into the record this statement from 50 public health experts about the importance of science in our pandemic response. I'd also like to enter into the record an op-ed written by Dr. Jha, the minority witness in the prior hearing regarding his experience before this committee. And finally, I'd like to enter statements from 4 public health and scientific organizations that discuss scientific integrity and the needs of our communities during this pandemic. Without objection, they could be entered into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, Senate hearings, like medical treatments, should be based on evidence. This hearing, like the hearing before it and the hearing before that, is unfortunately not. I very much regret that in this time of need, Americans cannot turn to this committee for some sound guidance. Mr. Chairman, we can still turn the tide of this pandemic. We can work together to ensure that scientists have the resources that they need to conduct research, and federal agencies have the resources they need to support and evaluate these efforts. We should be working to ensure that doctors, nurses, and first responders have personal protective equipment that they need to care for patients in a safe manner. We should be passing bipartisan legislation that provides desperately needed financial relief to families, states, and small businesses. And in the coming weeks, we expect that the first coronavirus vaccines will become available. We should be conducting strong oversight, including hearing testimony from government officials responsible for vaccine development and distribution. The Commerce Committee will be holding a subcommittee on how we'll ensure every American can get a vaccine later this week. We'll be discussing that. And I look forward to participating in a robust discussion with both scientific and logistics experts. We owe it to the American people to get this right. And sadly, today's hearing will not provide accurate scientific information or advance any useful efforts to slow the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator Peters. I hope anybody who listened to that opening statement, anybody who's read the articles prior to this hearing, will actually go back and take a look at the video that we edited of our previous hearing. Then I hope they actually listen to the witnesses and to their testimony and to the questions and answers, and just really understand how far from reality the ranking member's opening statement truly was. Now, it is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so those of you on WebEx, if you'll just raise your right hand. 2 witnesses here, if you'll stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you would give before this committee would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. I do.
Be seated. Our first witness is Dr. Ramin Oskoui. At best, I get him 50% right. Dr. Oskoui is a native Washingtonian. He is a graduate of Georgetown University College of Arts and Sciences and Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He trained at Georgetown University Hospital in internal medicine and cardiovascular disease at Washington Hospital Center. He is board certified in internal medicine and cardiovascular diseases. He is CEO of Foxhall Cardiology in Washington, D.C. He is a past president of the medical staff at Sibley Memorial Hospital and was Physician of the Year for 2015 for Sibley Memorial Hospital, Johns Hopkins. Since 1996, his peers have continuously voted him as one of Washingtonian Magazine's top doctors in cardiology. He has treated several dozen COVID-19 patients patients and has published in the area. And since I announced your presence at this hearing, I've heard from all kinds of patients what a fabulous doctor you are.
You're very kind.
Thank you for coming here. Thank you for being a doctor. Dr. Oskoui.
It's my honor. I'm going to just read from my brief personal statement. I've been
And make sure your microphone's on and that the microphone is close to your mouth so we can hear.
I don't see a red light on it, but it looks like it's green. Okay. My name is Dr. Ramin Oskoui. I'm a board-certified cardiologist and internist who is licensed to practice in D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And as the Senator correctly stated, I've treated several dozen COVID patients since the outbreak of the pandemic. My remarks are directed in part to the differing roles and responsibilities of scientific researchers and government agencies and practicing physicians in a healthcare crisis. Whenever there's a health crisis, whether it's a worldwide pandemic or a family member hit with stroke or heart attack, our nation's practicing physicians not only the critical first responders, in many cases, they are the only ones on the line working with and for the patient. There are brilliant practitioners of academic medicine and MD PH.D.s, many of them employed by our most profitable drug companies who develop seemingly miraculous cures or therapies. But it is the frontline physicians who certainly, with the help of scientific researchers and billion-dollar drug pharmaceutical companies, must fight and win the war against disease, particularly a disease or ailment that is new and we don't have decades of research to look back on, with patients who, if we do nothing, may suffer and die needlessly. Why then, with a disease we had never seen before in late March, are practicing physicians being condemned, ridiculed, or shamed in some cases for doing what practicing physicians have always done, using their professional skills and expertise to make the best practical, life-saving use of the existing scientific research? It would be wonderful if, last March, the FDA or the NIH or a few big drug companies could have announced an instant cure for a disease that had just been discovered. Or, of course, in that event, we would have all prescribed it. Easy peasy. But they didn't have it then, and they don't have it now. That's one reason why the FDA encourages the use of FDA-approved drugs approved for one disease to be responsibly and ethically used in the field for other ailments not yet researched or approved. In fact, that is how many cures or treatments get discovered. Drugs or treatments invented and tested for one disease or ailment are applied in a novel way or for an ailment or disease they have not yet been approved for or tested with. The health policy establishment's criticism of the frontline doctors was over the top, and it was unfounded. First, for example, drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which are FDA approved for certain uses, have extensive safeguards, even for non-approved uses. They were both approved decades ago and have an established record of efficacy and a comprehensive information on possible side effects that physicians can review and are legally and ethically required to review before prescribing. Secondly, the fact is that no doctor should be prescribing these drugs, or in fact any drug, without following standard protocols observed for any drug or any patient. Even if there is FDA-approved scientific research proving that hydroxychloroquine works for malaria, its approved use, or lupus, a long-standing alternative use, one must do a case history and consider the individual patient before prescribing it. Practicing medicine may be an art as much as a science, but it is certainly not, quote, paint by the number. Earlier this year, we faced a new, dangerously infectious virus in such a health crisis. Like any other crisis with an unknown and unproven enemy, cannot rely exclusively on the tried and true. But it was worse than that. Affirmative steps to keep physicians and patients ignorant were taken. Indeed, censorship of scientific research, indeed medical McCarthyism, became the norm. It is not an insult against science to conclude that action should be taken in the midst of an emergency based on the best facts available, nor any more than it is an insult against history to use tactics or strategy in our national defense that have not been peer-reviewed. I believe that landing craft were rarely used in full-scale amphibious invasion before D-Day. The ones we developed specifically for that purpose obviously could not be tested in full battlefield conditions. Does that mean we could not go ahead with the Normandy invasion because we had no double-blind, peer-reviewed studies for these vehicles? I think weather forecast that day was a bit sketchy too. Even outside of an emergency, it is no disrespect to science to say some medical treatments that some physicians deem prudent for their patients should be allowed and, yes, promoted. even if those have not been the subject of someone's peer-reviewed PhD thesis or years of regulatory process. Very few of us will become drug company executives, top medical researchers, or high-ranking health bureaucrats. But it is almost guaranteed that each of us is quite likely, sometime, somewhere, to be a patient under the care of a trusted physician who will hopefully have the help, not the hindrance, of the research establishment. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Dr. Oskoui. Our next witness is via WebEx, Dr. Jean-Jacques Rajter. Dr. Rajter is a Broward Health Medical Center physician who specializes in pulmonary medicine, internal medicine, and critical care. He previously served as the Chief Medical Information Officer for Broward Health and as an assistant professor at Drexel University College of Medicine. Dr. Rajter serves as a speaker for GlaxoSmithKline, AstraZeneca, and Forest Laboratories, as well as serves on advisory boards for Pfizer. His publications most recently include a study titled, quote, "Use of Ivermectin is associated with lower mortality in hospitalized patients with coronavirus disease," 2019, unquote. Dr. Rajter received his MD from the Drexel University College of Medicine and has accumulated over 22 years of experience in his field. Dr. Rajter.
Thank you very much. Honorable Chairman and Senators of the Committee on Homeland Security. My name is Dr. Jean-Jacques Rajter. I'm unfortunately unable to attend these hearings in person as I'm currently taking care of over 35 hospitalized patients. And it's an honor and privilege to stand here in front of the committee providing firsthand experience on the early treatment for COVID-19. My team has gained extensive experience with the treatment of COVID-19 in both inpatients and outpatients during this pandemic. Back in April, we were faced with a rapidly deteriorating patient population with no effective treatment. Extraordinary times called for extraordinary measures. I could not stand idly by as I've seen more people die in these last 6 months than I've seen in my entire medical career combined. Based on in vitro data by Dr. Wagstaff, my team was able to develop and implement an ivermectin-based protocol that showed tremendous success in treating COVID-19. This laid the foundation for the peer-reviewed ICON study, which was published in CHEST, a major US-based medical journal. The overall mortality in that study decreased from 25% in the conventional care group to 15% in the ivermectin-treated group. In patients with severe pulmonary disease at onset, the mortality decreased from 81% to 39%. During the second wave of the pandemic, it was common for my team to treat in excess of 40 patients with COVID-19 on a daily basis. This ICON protocol has been optimized since, and we have learned a lot from our successes and failures. The success rate of the ivermectin-based protocol is now far superior to what it was in its early days. Ivermectin-based protocols have now been studied across the world, yet no major large-scale double-blind randomized controlled study has yet been published in a peer-reviewed journal. I will defer more review of the literature to Dr. Kory, who is going to be testifying later. Recent in vitro studies confirmed our clinical experience that the dosing regimen of ivermectin 200 micrograms per kilogram on 2 consecutive days was clinically effective. Of the hundreds of outpatients treated by my team, only 2, I repeat 2, were admitted to the hospital. 1 due to heart failure, the other one due to symptomatic delay of over a week before seeking medical attention. Neither one of them died. Neither one of them needed intubation. Both of them have now been discharged to home without complications. Ivermectin is a widely used medication with excess of 3.7 billion doses administered worldwide. It is currently part of the World Health Organization model list of essential medications. The ICON dosing regimen is based on currently accepted dosing regimen for Norwegian scabies. The dosing regimen has long-standing safety data. Safety of a medication is due to its pharmacokinetics and possible interactions, but not on its intended use. As is the case with any infection, early intervention has been proven time over again that is of critical importance. The same is true for COVID-19. Early intervention increases the likelihood of keeping people out of the hospital and hence decreasing the pressure on the healthcare system. Early intervention is cost-effective as it decreases the overall healthcare expenditure. Early intervention decreases viral shedding and viral transmission in the home setting, which is currently believed to be a major site of transmission. Early intervention increases survival. Early intervention decreases the economic impact. Notwithstanding impending vaccination programs, vaccines are not 100% effective and may not be widely available for many months. Many patients may be unable to take the vaccines for healthcare reasons or opt not to do so. Long-term immunity of these vaccines has not yet been documented. Based on these factors, treatment for COVID-19 will need to remain on the forefront even after vaccination programs are initiated. Ivermectin is effective in early disease, late disease, post-exposure prophylaxis, and pre-exposure prophylaxis. Ivermectin is an oral medication requiring no monitoring. Ivermectin is safe. Ivermectin is inexpensive and widely available. The US has spent billions of dollars on a multitude of treatment options. My team is ready to proceed with the randomized controlled trials to address any residual doubt relating to ivermectin use, yet we're unable to do so due to lack of funding and support. A few $100,000 may definitively prove or disprove the effectiveness of ivermectin for early treatment with a properly designed and implemented randomized controlled trial. Funding, a little bit more funding, could look at the effectiveness of pre and post-exposure prophylaxis using ivermectin. A couple $1 million could complete a multi-center, double-blind, inpatient, placebo-controlled trial for ivermectin. Ladies and gentlemen, I implore you as a frontline provider of COVID-19 to do better, to provide us the answers we need as healthcare providers to help your constituents survive this horrible pandemic in great numbers. After personally witnessing the results of ivermectin-based protocols, I cannot stand by and allow hundreds of thousands of people to go untreated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajter. Our next witness is here in person, Dr. Pierre Kory. Dr. Kory is the former Associate Professor and Chief of the Critical Care Service and Medical Director of the Trauma and Life Support Center at the University of Wisconsin, and recently joined the ICU service at Aurora St. Luke Medical Center in Milwaukee. He is board certified in critical medicine, pulmonary diseases, and internal medicine. Dr. Kory has traveled across multiple states in the U.S. to care for COVID-19 patients throughout the pandemic. He is also the president of the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, a nonprofit organization of critical care specialists led by Professor Paul Marik, whose mission over the last 9 months is focused on the research and development of effective treatment protocols for COVID-19 using repurposed drugs. He received his MD from St. George's University School of Medicine, and I'll only add that we added Dr. Kory very late to our hearing in May because I'd heard of his development of, anti-inflammatory steroids in critical care on COVID. And Dr. Kory, I have to tell you, I've had doctors come up to me and thank me for holding that hearing where they listened to you, change their thinking. They believe they've saved their patients' lives because of your testimony at that hearing. I hope your testimony will be as impactful today. Dr. Kory.
Senator, thank you, and thank you for holding this hearing. I just want to start out, I didn't think I'd have to say this, but I want to register my offense at the ranking member's opening statement. I was discredited as a politician. I am a physician and a man of science. I have done nothing but commit myself to scientific truth and the care of patients. And to hear that I'm here because of a political angle, I am not a politician, I'm a physician. I want to start out by saying that I'm not speaking as an individual, I'm speaking on behalf of the organization that I'm a part of. We are a group of some of the most highly published physicians in the world. We have near 2,000 peer-reviewed publications among us, led by Professor Paul Marik, who's our intellectual leader. We came together early on in the pandemic, and all we have sought is to review the world's literature on every facet of this disease, trying to develop effective protocols. You just mentioned that I was here in May, and I recommended that it was critical that we use corticosteroids in this disease when all of the national and international healthcare organizations said we cannot use those. That turned out to be a life-saving recommendation. I am here again today with a new recommendation. In the last 9 months, in our review of all of the literature as a group, again, we are some of the most highly published physicians in our specialty and the world. We have done nothing but try to figure out how to identify a repurposed and available drug to treat this illness. We have now come to the conclusion after 9 months, and I have to point out, I am severely troubled by the fact that the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, I do not know of any task force that was assigned or compiled to review repurposed drugs in an attempt to treat this disease. Everything has been about novel and or expensive pharmaceutically engineered drugs, things like tocilizumab and remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies and vaccines. We have 100 years of medicine development. We know we are expert in all the medicines we use, and I do not know of a task force that has been focused on repurposed drugs. I will tell you that my group and our organization, I will say that we have filled that void. That is all we have done is focus on the things we know and things we do. And I'm here to tell you, Dr. Rajter, he just presented. He has one study of the many that I want to talk about. And I want to talk about that we have a solution to this crisis. There is a drug that is proving to be of miraculous impact. And when I say miracle, I do not use that term lightly. And I don't want to be sensationalized when I say that. That is a scientific recommendation based on mountains of data that has emerged in the last 3 months. When I am told, and I just had to hear this in the opening sentence, that we are touting things that are not FDA or NIH recommended, let me be clear. The NIH, their recommendation on ivermectin, which is to not use it outside of controlled trials, is from August 27th. We are now in December. This is 3 to 4 months later. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. If you take it, you will not get sick. I want to briefly summarize the data. My manuscript, again, published by some of the most, we have contributed more to the medical knowledge of our specialty in our careers than anyone else can claim as a group. And our manuscript, which was posted on Medicine Preprint Server, details all of this evidence. I want to briefly summarize it. Number one, we have evidence that ivermectin is effective not only in prophylaxis, in the prevention. If you take it, you will not get sick. We just came across a trial last night from Argentina by the lead investigator of ivermectin in Argentina, Dr. Hector Carvalho. They prophylaxed 800 healthcare workers. Not one got sick. In the 400 that they didn't prophylax with ivermectin, 58% got sick. 237 of those 400 got sick. If you take it, you will not get sick. It has immense and potent antiviral activity. We know that from the first study in Monash, it has made the bench to the bedside. Prophylaxis, we now have 4 large randomized controlled trials totaling over 1,500 patients, each trial showing that as a prophylaxis agent, it is immensely effective. You will not get sick. You will be protected from getting ill if you take it. In early outpatient treatment, we have 3 randomized controlled trials and multiple observation as well as case series showing that if you take ivermectin, the need for hospitalization and death will decrease. The most profound evidence we have is in the hospitalized patients. We have 4 randomized controlled trials there, multiple observation trials, all showing the same thing. You will not die, or you will die at much, much, much lower rates. Statistically significant, large magnitude results if you take ivermectin. It is proving to be a wonder drug. It has already won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 for its impacts on global health in the eradication of parasitic diseases. It is proving to be an immensely powerful antiviral and anti-inflammatory agent. It is critical for its use in this disease. We, again, stand by our manuscript. It is a scientific manuscript. It's been submitted for peer review. But please recognize peer review takes time. It takes months. We do not have months. We have 100,000 patients in the hospital right now dying. I'm a lung specialist. I'm an ICU specialist. I've cared for more dying COVID patients than anyone can imagine. They're dying because they can't breathe. They can't breathe. They're on high-flow oxygen delivery devices. They're on non-invasive ventilators, and or they're sedated and paralyzed and attached to mechanical ventilators that breathe for them. And I watch them every day. They die. By the time they get me in the ICU, they're already dying. They're almost impossible to recover. Early treatment is key. We need to offload the hospitals. We are tired. I can't keep doing this. If you look at my manuscript, and if I have to go back to work next week, any further deaths are going to be needless deaths, and I cannot be traumatized by that. I cannot keep caring for patients when I know that they could have been saved with earlier treatment, and that drug that will treat them and prevent the hospitalization is ivermectin. I am here today, I'm calling to action. The NIH, their last recommendation was August 27th. August 27th. I want to be clear. I am not here as a politician or a dramatist or sensationalizing what I'm recommending. I am going to be very clear and very simple. All I ask is for the NIH to review our data that we've compiled of all of the emerging data. We have almost 30 studies. Everyone is reliably and reproducibly positive, showing the dramatic impacts of ivermectin. Please, I'm just asking that they review our manuscript. It is a serious manuscript by serious, highly experienced physicians and researchers. I cannot call on more credibility than we have. We're not just a random doctor who's saying that we have a cure. I don't want to say I have a cure. I'm just asking, review our data. We have immense amounts of data to show that ivermectin must be implemented and implemented now. Senator, the last thing I want to say is, you know who's dying here? It's our African-American and Latino and elderly. It's some of the most disadvantaged and impoverished members of our society. They are dying at higher rates than anyone else. It's the most severe discrepancy I've seen in my medical career. And we are responsible to protect those disadvantaged members. We have a special duty to provide countermeasures. The amount of evidence to show that ivermectin is life-saving and protective is so immense, and the drug is so safe. My colleagues have talked about it. It must be instituted and implemented. I am asking the NIH to review our data and come up with recommendations for society. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank Dr. Kory, and I will make you this guarantee that before the day is out, we'll have a letter. First of all, we'll enter all your data into our hearing record, and then I'll have a letter to the NIH asking them to review it.
Please,
okay?
and
hopefully I'll have some senators join me in that. Our next witness is Dr. Armand Balboni. Dr. Balboni is the Chief Executive Officer for Appili Therapeutics. His career has included medical research and drug development experience in civilian, academic, and military organizations. He's a partner and a member of the board of directors of Bloom Burton & Company, where he is the firm's senior advisor for regulatory medical affairs. As an active duty military officer, Dr. Balboni served as a staff officer in the U.S. Army Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. He completed a military staff fellowship at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and wanted to serve as the Deputy Director of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs for the U.S. Army. Dr. Balboni has held multiple academic positions at Westfield State University, the University of Maryland University College, and the United States Military Academy at West Point. Dr. Balboni completed his doctoral work in the MD PH.D. program at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and earned his law degree at Brooklyn Law School. Dr. Balboni.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, and the entire committee for your leadership and the opportunity to speak today about the need for early treatment of COVID-19.
So, Dr. Balboni, if you could talk a little bit louder, if we could boost his...
Sure. Is that any better?
It is, thanks.
All right, great. So again, thank you for this opportunity to speak. As you've noted, I've worked in the infectious disease front lines in many roles. I'm a simple drug development physician and scientist, and I say that with all humility. As a military fellow at the FDA during the Ebola crisis, we looked at some of these drugs, broad spectrum antivirals, to include things like favipiravir and remdesivir. We are no further along now than we were then with getting those drugs approved because of the very fragmented nature of what we do as our approach to treating these kinds of illnesses. I have to say, and I never thought I would have to say this, but I am a lifelong Democrat with a subscription to the New York Times. And I have to say I was quite dismayed this morning and almost didn't participate when I saw the news that I was participating as a fringe member of an anti-vaxxer group. That couldn't be further from the truth. I read further down in the New York Times and saw that 202,000 new cases were presented yesterday in the U.S. And I'm confronted with the motto that accompanied me in over 17 years as a physician and scientist in the U.S. Army: one team, one fight, and mission first. We've got to get this right. I remain deeply concerned with our long-term viability to combat not only COVID-19, but other pandemics that inevitably will happen. We have to take a whole of government approach. The last 11 months have shown us what we can do when we do that. It's redefined what's possible for vaccine development. We may be on the precipice of new technologies that will absolutely inform how we develop vaccines in the future, but we are not done. Many are ready to say that we did it with vaccines and some effective treatments that have been noted to be quite expensive and useful in limited situations. But we're failing to adequately build a continuum of solutions, data-driven solutions for COVID-19 and the inevitable future pandemics. We need options now at every stage and in scalable and readily implementable ways as the crisis worsens. We need oral broad-spectrum therapeutics to be able to treat patients in the outpatient setting. We can't treat them adequately, and we can't continue to send newly infected patients home with this potential hope of an IV infusion and say, put on a mask and wait for the vaccine. We can't live with the outcomes there. I tip my hat to my colleagues at infusion clinics and those setting up clinics in tents and parking lots, but the drugs are too expensive, not available, and unlikely to help the hundreds of thousands of patients that are coming out of this. The vast majority of Americans, just to be clear, who test positive, we tell them to self-quarantine, employ watchful waiting, and then go to the hospital if they have beds, if their symptoms worsen. This protocol confirms that we have a gap in our treatment landscape. We need an oral SARS-CoV-2 specific treatment right now that helps to treat those with confirmed infections, and one that's practicable, scalable, and can bring a plug-and-play type of approach to our healthcare system. As this committee addressed, and my colleagues that are witnesses here have also addressed, we have to include vaccines and best medical practices. Nobody is denying that. Nobody here is an anti-vaxxer. And I have to say, I take great offense to that statement as a scientist and physician. Oral antivirals targeting SARS-CoV-2 offer a strong solution. We have the potential to play an important role in the hands of physicians treating their COVID-19 patients outside of the hospital. Again, these drugs are not intended to replace COVID-19 vaccines, and many promising oral antivirals are most effective when used early. Most patients will never have access to them as we attempt to wring all the risk out of our large randomized control trials to fully read out. We as a group are running 2 large phase 3 trials in the US under IND and a phase 2 post-exposure prophylaxis trial in long-term care. We are doing that work, and I do not suggest that we abandon our gold standard RCTs. However, to singularly rely on RCTs in the middle of a pandemic is just not common sense. We need to develop hybrid trial methodologies by combining the best parts of RCTs and observational studies to produce real-world data right now that can, together with our RCTs, present real-world evidence about how these things can be used. It's our best chance to save lives now and during future outbreaks. If we fail to change our approach, we're going to be talking about this the next time there's an outbreak. It's going to happen. It's unfortunate, but we've got to utilize this pandemic to bring solutions to these patients right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee, for your consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Balboni. Our next witness is Dr. Jane Orient. Dr. Orient has served as the Executive Director of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, AAPS, since 1989, and is currently President of Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. More than 200 of her papers and op-ed pieces have been published in the scientific and popular literature on a variety of subjects, including risk assessment, natural and technological hazards and non-hazards, and medical economics and ethics. She's the editor of AAPS News, the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness newsletter, Civil Defense Perspectives, and is the managing editor of the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Orient obtained her undergraduate degrees in chemistry and mathematics from the University of Arizona in Tucson and her MD from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons in 1974. Dr. Orient is formerly clinical faculty in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Arizona College of Medicine and has been in solo private practice of general internal medicine since 1981. Dr. Orient.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Peters and committee members for allowing me to present the plea of practicing physicians for early and prophylactic home treatment for COVID-19, and also thanks to the witnesses for the opportunity to learn from you. We urge the committee to exercise your oversight functions over federal agencies that are effectively blocking treatment that could prevent 100,000 needless deaths and stop the crippling fear and the destruction of millions of livelihoods. On August 18th, Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Mike Lee, and Senator Ted Cruz asked the FDA to provide any studies and data that informed the FDA's apparent determination that giving hydroxychloroquine to infected outpatients within 7 days from the onset of symptoms will have no clinical effect and may be harmful to the patient. FDA's tardy response provided no references pertaining to the question. The only logical conclusion is that the FDA's extremely influential determination that prevented treatment for untold thousands of patients was without foundation. FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn has stated correctly that FDA has no authority to regulate the practice of medicine and that doctors have the right to prescribe approved drugs for off-label uses. But as AAPS has shown in its lawsuit against the FDA, state agencies have used the FDA's language as the basis of regulations to block or forbid the prescribing or dispensing of hydroxychloroquine. In March, HHS Secretary Azar asked BARDA for a nationwide expanded access investigational new drug protocol for hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine in the National Strategic Stockpile, but this would have legitimized these drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 outside a hospital. But instead, influential physicians or officials, non-physicians, transformed the request into an emergency use authorization only for hospitalized patients, to the patients who were the least likely to benefit. So instead of expanding access, the EUA restricted access. And later, FDA withdrew the EUA, further impeding its use, and the HHS is presumably still hoarding more than 50 million doses of hydroxychloroquine while people are complaining about a potential shortage. At its November meeting, the AMA refused to rescind its unprecedented statement calling for physicians to stop prescribing hydroxychloroquine until sufficient evidence becomes available to conclusively illustrate that benefit outweighs harm. Yet there have been 192 studies compiled on hydroxychloroquine, with all showing some benefit when used early, in contrast to the handful of studies on remdesivir or monoclonal antibodies, which are the only things that the NIH recommends. More than 65 years of experience and hundreds of millions of patients have demonstrated safety. Hydroxychloroquine is safer than most over-the-counter drugs, including acetaminophen. However, organized medicine and academic physicians such as Dr. Ashish Jha have stated that the evidence is insufficiently scientific, doesn't meet their gold standards of the randomized controlled trial. But the fact is that most of the guidelines that we use for most diseases have relied on lower orders of evidence necessarily. And studies with appropriately analyzed data give results identical to RCTs. And RCTs themselves are not infallible because they can be designed to succeed or designed to fail. Researchers in 2 hydroxychloroquine trials even used toxic or lethal doses of the drug, and then noticed that, yeah, it did harm. Publications in the most prestigious journals does not assure reliability. There were huge studies that were based on probably fabricated data with flaws that were undetected by the peer reviewers or the editors. rushed into publication and had to be retracted by Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, but not quickly enough to prevent their significant misleading and harmful effects. RCTs are useful for testing, but they're not for making discoveries, which are often serendipitous, like the use of ivermectin, for example, in nursing home patients with scabies. The smallpox vaccine was discovered because GPs were sharing observations, now we call them anecdotes, at the pub. They noticed that farmers who had had cowpox didn't seem to get smallpox. Or they may result from the study of basic science and observation on patients, like today's protocol for Wegener granulomatosis was based on a 1973 article of non-randomized patients, which was written by none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci. Today, we have top-down, authority-based standard of care for early COVID promulgated by NIH guidelines, which is therapeutic nihilism. We lately added the expensive, largely unavailable monoclonal antibodies, but other than that, before the patient's in the hospital and on oxygen, the NIH recommends nothing. This is shocking and unprecedented, but in today's litigious environment, doctors who follow this standard of care are protected, and those who dare prescribe outside of it could be fired, removed from their insurance panels, investigated, and even delicensed. Patients nationwide are calling us at AAPS searching for a doctor who will treat them. One patient told me he had had his wife drive him all the way to Dallas when all the doctors he knew in Tucson refused to prescribe for him, and his symptoms got better within hours of getting hydroxychloroquine from the doctor in Dallas. Doctors are reporting to us that they can't get hydroxychloroquine for their nursing home patients, and the family doctors even told us that infectious disease specialists have refused to treat COVID patients. We're relying on quarantines, masks, and lockdowns. These are not backed by RCTs. They have not stopped the pandemic. They're not sustainable. Vaccines are touted as the great hope, but we don't have them yet, and they have not yet been shown to prevent contagion. What we need now is effective early treatment for COVID-19. Hydroxychloroquine and other safe, long-used agents, such as ivermectin, is showing particular promise, but there are others. They could be immediately available if the government stopped blocking access and deterring their use. Physicians need to do as they've always done. They need to respond to the needs of their patients, use the best available information, share that information, and continuously strive to do better. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Orient. Our final witness is Dr. J. Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya is professor of medicine at Stanford University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research. Dr. Bhattacharya's research focuses on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations with a particular emphasis on the role of government programs, biomedical innovation, and economics. Dr. Bhattacharya's recent research focuses on the epidemiology of COVID-19, as well as an evaluation of policy responses to the epidemic. Dr. Bhattacharya was the senior author of the first studies of the seroprevalence of COVID-19 in Los Angeles County and Santa Clara County, as well as the Major League Baseball seroprevalence study. He is the co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, which urges an end to lockdowns and the adoption of a focused protection strategy to address the COVID-19 epidemic. He has published 135 articles in top peer-reviewed scientific journals in medicine, economics, health policy, epidemiology, statistics, law, and public health, among other fields. He holds an MD and a PhD in economics, both earned at Stanford University. Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I feel a little bit out of place because I'm going to be talking about how well we've done, or how dangerous the epidemic is as far as patients are concerned. I'll cite some statistics on that, and I'll talk about the policy response. But I will also return to the theme of this hearing, which is on the incentives to evaluate therapies, especially therapies that don't have a financial interest behind them. So let me first start with some comments on how dangerous COVID-19 is at an individual level. Early in the epidemic, the World Health Organization publicized a very misleading 3.4% case fatality rate that panicked the world. The number is misleading because for the typical person infected, the usual outcome spans the range from no symptoms whatsoever to a mild cold to the severe viral pneumonia that the media highlights and that we've heard about in this hearing. Thus, many infections are not identified as cases, especially in the early days, because they didn't come to the attention of doctors or public health authorities. We know from a series of studies of specific SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in the blood, which provide evidence of prior COVID infection, that this is true. And from these studies, we can estimate the true COVID infection survival rate. Because of a recent publication of the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, surveying 61 of these studies worldwide, we now have a good estimate of the infection survival rate. It turns out to vary by orders of magnitude by age, which is the single most important risk factor, although there are others. For people 70 and over, the infection survival rate is 95%. It's a deadly disease, especially for older people. For people under 70, though, the infection survival rate is 99.95%. Let me say that number again, 99.95%. And with improvements in treatment and patient management, like dexamethasone, as we've heard about, and also improved ventilator protocols, these numbers are improving all the time. And they could be better. At the same time, the harms of the lockdown are manifold and devastating, including plummeting childhood vaccination rates, worse cardiovascular disease outcomes, less cancer screening, deteriorating mental health, to name just a few. The toll is already high, and it will get worse in coming years as more people come in with late-stage cancer, worsening diabetes, and advanced heart disease that should have been identified and treated this year. The social isolation induced by lockdown has led to a sharp rise in opioid and drug-related overdoses, similar to the deaths of despair that occurred in the wake of the 2008 Great Recession. Social isolation of the elderly has contributed to a sharp rise in dementia-related deaths around the country. For children, the cessation of in-person schooling since the spring has led to catastrophic learning losses with severe projected adverse consequences for affected students' lifespans. According to a CDC estimate, 1 in 4 adults seriously considered suicide this past June. 1 in 4. Among 25 to 44-year-olds, the CDC reports a 26% increase in excess all-cause mortality relative to past years, even though fewer than 5% of the 2020 deaths in this age group has been due to COVID-19. The two main planks of the Great Brain Declaration and the focused protection ideas follow logically from these facts. For older people, COVID-19 is a deadly disease that should be met with overwhelming resources aimed at protecting them wherever they are, whether in nursing homes, in their home, their workplace, or multi-generational homes. They should be prioritized for vaccines, and we should be actively seeking widely available and effective treatments, as we've heard in this committee. For the non-vulnerable, those who face a far greater harm from the lockdowns than they do from COVID-19 infection risk, the lockdown should be lifted. And for those who so decide, normal life resumed. But what about better treatments for COVID-19 patients? I said earlier we've made a lot of progress in learning how to manage and treat the disease over the past months, but I think it has been a lot less than it should have been. Strikingly, the most useful advance in treatment involves the repurposing of a drug that is already in widespread use and entirely off patent, the steroid dexamethasone, which is effective in helping severely ill COVID patients avoid a deadly and detrimental immune response. As a professor of medicine, my inbox is filled with scientists and physicians who have ideas for similarly repurposing existing drugs, vitamins, minerals, and other therapies for early treatment of COVID-19 infection. For many of these ideas, there are good pathophysiological reasons and observational evidence to believe they might work. However, there's no randomized trials to evaluate whether they work. Doctors are free to use them off-label, that is, the FDA approved them for use for some past other indication, but they lack a gold standard evaluation of the efficacy of outpatient management, so most doctors will not use them. So to me, the question is, before dismissing these treatments as ineffective because of lack of randomized evidence, I think the question we need to answer is, why have there been so few randomized evaluations, especially large-scale ones, of these therapies? And for that answer, I'm going to put on my economist hat. For drugs and therapies on patent, a patent holder has a strong interest in running randomized evaluations, navigating the drug through the FDA's approval process. By contrast, for drugs and therapies with no patent holder, no one has much interest in funding expensive randomized trials or working assiduously to move the FDA regulatory process for rapid approval or even slow approval. The bottleneck then is not the FDA. It's the lack of a residual claimant for these drugs and treatment. Investigators working at academic medical centers may have a reputational interest in evaluating these drugs, and as we've seen, frontline doctors have an incentive to find good treatments for their patients, but they must find funds from somewhere for them, and pharmaceutical companies typically have no interest in it. In principle, the NIH exists to solve this market failure. It could and should use its resources to help fund randomized evaluations of these drugs for off-label purposes. And it has funded some important drug evaluation work, such as a study to determine the right dosage and metabolism of drugs prescribed for children with COVID-19. It's also funded some trials for drugs that for hospitalized patients. For the most part, though, they funded trials on patent drugs. The NIH has made comparatively little effort to catalyze randomized evaluations of off-patent drugs for COVID-19 therapeutics. By contrast, the NIH has devoted considerable resources to aid the COVID-19 vaccine randomized trial studies. Even the highest profile randomized evaluation, dexamethasone, was not funded by the NIH. The NIH's relative lack of interest in the rapid randomized evaluation of non-patented drug represents the government failure that has likely led to worse COVID-19 outcomes than we would have had otherwise. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. In an interesting display of closed-mindedness, I don't believe we have any Democrat senators that really are inquisitive enough to even ask any questions of this distinguished panel. I appreciate the fact that Senator and Dr. Paul is here, so what I'll do is I'll defer my questioning for Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by apologizing for the juvenile diatribe from the ranking member. Science is about having an open mind. Science is about disputation, debate, evidence, and it's discussed. And the contention and the back and forth is how we determine what the truth is. But if you close your mind completely to this and are not willing to listen, I think that's how science dies. That's when we say, well, the government consensus or the scientific consensus is this. Well, that's the closing of the scientific mind, and that's a recipe for a disaster. Science is also not about ad hominem and attacks. So by attacking this panel without listening to it, leaving in a huff, and having no questions shows a small-mindedness, a closed-mindedness, and really it should be everything that we should avoid. I'm not here to be an advocate for one treatment over the other, and I will ask some tough questions to the panel. But I'm open-minded enough to listen to their side and see and try to determine whether or not it's a good treatment or bad. But to immediately close our mind, I think is a bad way of looking at this. I had a good friend die yesterday from this, so I'm not one who's saying this isn't a deadly disease. She lived a couple doors down, and we're sad. Kelly and I are both sad about what happened. About 6 months ago, we had a friend who died in their 30s, not from the disease, but from lack of a stress EKG. She died from a terminal arrhythmia in her 30s with 2 young children, but her stress EKG was canceled because the government decided that we shouldn't do it. It was an elective procedure. It was delayed, and she died from a terminal arrhythmia. So people do also die from the decisions that people make. The most important thing is no one person is right. The panelists are not all right, and people should question them and go back and forth, and we try to figure out the truth from that. But it's a mistake to say that one person should have all the power to determine what we should do when we place too much confidence in government doctors such as Dr. Fauci. Dr. Kory mentioned that he mentioned in June about steroids. I mentioned it in March when Dr. Fauci came into my committee hearing. My first thought about the final pathway here with COVID in the end stages is it's not too dissimilar from other final pathways of adult respiratory distress syndrome. I had a friend who was a surgeon who got the strep-eating flesh from operating on somebody who had it, and a blood splatter, he got it. The chance of losing your limbs is like 50 to 70%. It's like a 50% chance of losing all your limbs. I mean, it's a devastating disease, but one of the final common pathways like COVID is your blood vessels leak fluid into your lungs. It's a sort of a toxic shock kind of syndrome. They treated him with high-dose steroids, and so I raised my hand to Dr. Fauci and said, do you think steroids might have a role in this? And he sort of dismissed me and said that the studies were showing that it probably wouldn't work. But I would think most people would argue now that one of the most significant developments in the acute care of the COVID patient has been the steroids, actually, and trying to get them the steroids before they've gotten into the full ARDS syndrome. Some are even getting it at a very early stage in the disease. But that came from people asking questions, being skeptical, and not letting one doctor, such as Dr. Fauci, say, oh, that's not right, young man, go sit in the corner. We need to have an open mind. I'm not saying I'm always right. I'm a bystander, and I'm not an expert in COVID, but I try to ask the important questions. One of the questions that I'd like to ask, and I think this is the difficulty of proving the situation on either ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, is that because so many people get better, the control group might be 99% of the people get better. Then you give hydroxychloroquine to this same group, and you might get 99.5%. It's going to be a difficult thing to actually prove in trials that you get a benefit. It sounds like in some of the sicker patients where you had a mortality, where you had a 25% mortality down to 15%, that does sound significant. Now you're getting into the sicker patients. With the outpatient studies, one of the critiques is that so many people get better naturally. How are you proving that it's statistically significant? And what comes to my mind is sort of like when we wanted to prove that taking an aspirin a day was good to prevent heart attacks. It took like 10 years and 10,000, people in the study because it was just hard to show the differences of whether an aspirin worked or not. And I think the same thing is true with either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin in an outpatient setting, is that because so many people get better on their own. The converse is when you're really sick, because it's hard to get to treat people who are very sick. It's hard to prove that anything works when people are very sick. But I guess what I'd like to do is open it for the panel one by one to explain how we answer the critique that most of these people are getting better anyway. So how you proven that your treatment works in a group of people who didn't go to the hospital, so that you're selecting out actually for the people who may well have been, did you prevent them from getting seriously sick, or have you selected out as your patient pool because they're outpatient, tending to be people who are going to get better? Why don't we'll start with those who are here. We'll start with Dr. Oskoui, and then we'll go to Dr. Kory.
And let me quick interject, because we have such low participation. Take whatever time you have for whatever questions you have. Dr. Oskoui.
Thank you very much, Senator Paul, and I appreciate your introduction. I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as a treater. I'll be very practical, and I'll defer to Dr. Kory from his experience as an intensivist. My clinical approach to patients are that they have symptoms, that I treat them early, and I typically risk stratify patients getting LDH levels, lymphocyte counts, and other blood panels whenever possible. When I've used hydroxychloroquine and oftentimes ivermectin, I've had patients go to the hospital if I didn't have an EKG or another good assessment, and I've always clinically evaluated the patients I've treated. But I risk stratify them. You may or may not know a husband and wife couple that I know Senator Johnson knows, who I treated the wife and not the husband, because I didn't deem the husband to be sick enough to warrant treatment, although perfectly safe to, but his wife was much sicker. So I think this has to be, to some degree, left in the discretion of the clinicians. In terms of the data, I provided the clerk of this committee, Ms. Kilbride, PDFs of numerous clinical trials on many of these drugs, not limited but including hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, vitamin D, zinc, and a few other medications, and those trials are there. But the fact that we've had third world countries, second world countries that have been more innovative and have outperformed us in terms of survival, I think is something that warrants questioning. And one has to wonder if our bloated research academic bureaucracy has been more of a hindrance than a help during this healthcare crisis. But I'll turn this to whomever. I hope that's satisfactory.
Dr. Kory?
Senator Paul, I appreciate your question, and it's critical, the content of your question, which is how can we tell when something's working when many patients get better? And there's only one answer to that. And we know what that is, and it's one of the central tenets of science, which is you need a control group. You need to have a group that is comparable to those that you treat, and then you compare them to those that you don't treat. What I am trying to message today is in our manuscript, we now have 11 randomized controlled trials. Every one of those controlled trials show that in the ivermectin-treated group, lives are saved. There's less need for hospitalization. There's less transmission, less case counts. It is a fundamentally and powerfully effective therapy against COVID-19. We need the NIH to review these data. We have the data. Let me say, the amount of patients in those randomized controlled trials, in the 11 trials, total nearly 4,000, with over half treated with ivermectin. Let's remind ourselves that the treatment of COVID-19 fundamentally changed after the recovery trial was announced in June. That was a trial of 6,000 patients. 2,000 were treated with steroids, and it showed the dramatic and life-saving properties of corticosteroids. Almost overnight, the treatment of COVID-19 changed as a result of that trial. That was the recovery trial. I am presenting a paper today with more patients treated with ivermectin with larger magnitudes of benefit than the recovery trial. I will maintain that ivermectin should be the standard of care of this disease based on these data. It's not my opinion. It's the data. We have the data. If you give anyone else a placebo based on the data that's in our manuscript, I believe that would be malpractice, and you would lead to the heightened risk of death. No more placebo is needed.
So the 11 studies are inpatient or inpatient and outpatient?
They vary. So the randomized controlled trials, I almost can't describe what this data shows. People need to read the manuscript. We have 4 randomized controlled trials in prophylaxis, each and every one highly statistically significant. Patients or people, even citizens, healthy citizens on ivermectin do not get COVID.
And you're comparing it to placebo in these studies? You're considering it to this other
yes.
standard?
So in the prophylaxis studies alone, which is 4, they took COVID-19 patients who tested positive for COVID-19. They identified their household members. They gave them ivermectin. So they had a whole group of household contacts of COVID-19 patients who took ivermectin. The other households, they didn't give ivermectin. Every single randomized controlled trial shows that in the households that were on ivermectin, drastically reduced rates of transmission. The households did not get sick. You can protect people from this disease with ivermectin. That's just the prophylaxis trials. The outpatient trials.
So the outcome tested was how many people were positive, turned up positive?
How many people were positive, or how many people got symptoms? And they were drastically, statistically significant. These are and from multiple centers and countries around the world. That's just the prophylaxis. We also have trials on early outpatient as well as hospital. The most dramatic is the hospital. Almost every single one, we have 4 large randomized controlled trials in the hospital, all statistically significant reductions in mortality. Dr. Rajter has a large observational control trial from Broward County, and he's here on the panel today. In his trial, he also showed the same. The patients who got ivermectin died at far less rates.
And opponents of using ivermectin, have they responded to these, critiqued these? Has there been a generalized argument that they make, or has it been silenced?
So, the opponents, again, I want to call attention to the NIH and their recommendation. I don't say that they're an opponent. They made their last recommendation on ivermectin on August 27th, which is either 10 years ago or 4 months ago. I don't know which. August 27th, this was their recommendation. We recommend against the use of ivermectin outside of clinical trials. That recommendation was based on expert opinion only. There was no data to recommend or recommend against. It was an expert opinion.
Well, I'll be happy to join with the chairman in sending a letter to try to get an evaluation. If we could go to the same question, if we've got time, do you mind? Why don't we go to the rest of the panel and ask the same question? The problem, sort of from my perspective, still being, how do you determine an outcome of something that when you do nothing, the vast majority of outpatients actually get better also?
Start with Dr. Rajter.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. So to clarify something, people talk about asymptomatic patients, but I have kind of stopped using that nomenclature. I call them pre-symptomatic patients. We do not know offhand which one of these asymptomatic patients are going to develop severe disease and become symptomatic. That is problem number 1. Problem number 2. When I put in my written testimony and also during my earlier testimony, I talk about the early intervention and treatment to decrease viral shedding and viral transmission in the home setting. And that is currently believed to be the largest numbers of people getting infected or getting infected in the home setting. So that means a 20 or 30-year-old may do fine, but now comes Christmas, there is a family meeting, and that asymptomatic individual now infects other family members, including their 70, 80, 90-year-old grandma, and now we have a real problem. What we do know about ivermectin is that it literally destroys the virus in most people within 48 hours. So hence, you take somebody who is asymptomatic, but a carrier with the risk of transmission, and you essentially stop that right in their tracks. So you don't have an issue about that person now contaminating other people down the line, or you significantly decrease that risk. So that is really even a very different spin on that question that was asked. Now, to continue as far as the data, you're right, Senator, it will be difficult. My team currently has a study in place. We have the protocols written, ready to go. The only limiting factor was to get funding. I've tried everywhere. Getting the funding is extremely difficult. What we need to do is a large study, a large randomized control study to confirm the findings, to prove to the naysayers, you know what? Here is your golden standard. Now, the study that I did was an observational study, but it was propensity matched. That is the highest standard for a non-randomized controlled trial. And even there, it shows tremendous benefit. You spoke about the reduction in the overall mortality from 25 down to 15. Well, if you look at the overall mortality in people with severe lung involvement, that went from 81% down to 39%. That is even a more dramatic decrease in even these more severe individuals. It is a safe drug, a track record that is phenomenal, 3.7 billion doses administered. So I think we need to do those studies with the help of the NIH, CDC, or any one of those regulatory agencies. A study like that could be implemented within 30 days. Within another 30 days from that, we could have collected all the data. Within another 2-3 weeks from that, we should be able to have answers. If things are moved forward through the regulatory agencies, we can have our answers before this tragedy even worsens.
Dr. Balboni.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Senator Paul, for the question. I think I'll speak to the trials that we're running for favipiravir, broad-spectrum antiviral targeting RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. We're running currently 2 large placebo-controlled randomized phase 3 trials in the outpatient setting, early treatment and post-exposure prophylaxis. In addition, there are 2 phase 2s, one at Stanford in the outpatient setting and in long-term care as well. There are observational studies with thousands of data points and hundreds of smaller trials having been run in many countries around the world. We need to develop hybrid trial methodologies to combine all of these traditional RCTs and observational study designs to gather real-world evidence for the regulators. If we don't pool all of these data, we're going to see COVID-19 in our rearview mirror. We're going to quickly forget about it, and all of these potential treatments are going to fall by the wayside. So I agree with you. We need to gather the data. It will be large populations, but we have to make that commitment. The only way we can make these studies work is a true public-private partnership. Single companies, as we've heard, don't have the ability or the incentive to run these trials. Favipiravir, by the way, is off patent. We're doing this at risk as a consortium. There's very little support for this kind of work. And as soon as it falls away, we've got to be beholden to our shareholders and our boards. In the meantime, as a physician, I'm trying to do the right thing for patients. We need the assistance. We need government help. This has to be a whole of government approach and a commitment to going beyond this immediate problem, which is pressing and in our faces, but to do the right thing over the long haul, to gather the data, to silence the criticisms of these kinds of studies. Multiple small studies won't work, as you correctly point out. This is what we need. Gather the data, bundle it together, and make this available for future outbreaks. And the last thing I'll say is that as part of our trials, it is true that if we were to look only at mortality data, these trials would be unacceptably large and would take too long to run. We have been working with the regulators to look at time to resolution of symptoms, similar to what was done with oseltamivir or Tamiflu. We believe that is a stepwise approach, but it's taking too long to do this. We don't have a whole of government approach to this problem. And so I ask the committee, those present and those who have decided not to ask questions, to just please internalize this message. We need a whole of government approach similar to what was done with vaccines to gather the data to do exactly what you said, which is get to these large populations to show a difference.
So next, Dr. Orient, I see Senator Hawley on the computer, so we're going to check to see whether he wants to ask questions. But Dr. Orient, you want to answer that question?
Senator Paul, that's an excellent question that certainly applies to all types of research. I would say if you have a really sick patient, in a sense you have a controlled, historical control in that patient. If the patient is going downhill and you do something and the patient gets better, then that is evidence that maybe you did something right. On the other hand, if you have a patient who's doing pretty well and you do something and the patient suddenly gets worse, then you have to be worried that you might have caused that problem. If you have a bunch of patients who are healthy and they're going to do well no matter what, then I guess you really need to have a large study, and it looks like with ivermectin they have done that. There are, of course, many confounding variables, and then there are the ethical questions. If you have something that's going to protect your grandma, if it works, and doing nothing is going to put your grandma at risk, then are you engaging in some kind of human sacrifice to use a placebo? At what point does that become the thing? Some people have even suggested that maybe the RCT is outdated and we should be looking at other statistical approaches like Bayesian analysis so that we can get good data without running into this ethical dilemma and deal with the need maybe to have combination therapies and to deal with confounding variables.
Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Senator Paul, for that question. I mean, I think the gist of your question is right. When you have an outcome that's relatively rare, what you need is very, very large samples in order to test whether and a control group to test whether the treatment actually works. You can get some indication with observational studies. There are the difficulties that the treatment is not randomly assigned. But there are statistical methods to address that. And the great advantage of observational studies is that with these statistical methods, correcting for this sort of a selection bias in the treatment, you actually can get very large samples relatively inexpensively. So there's a procedure here I think we could follow. We could use data sets like the Medicare claims data, other claims data sets, and other readily available large scale data sets to check for in sort of well-designed observational studies to see if there's some promise to the kinds of treatments that people are thinking about. And you can do this for many, many, many treatments in principle. Lots of people with different ideas can check, and then use that to inform where the large trial should be run. I mean, I think that's one procedure. There are others one potentially could follow, but the key thing I want to get across is that it is possible if you just choose to do it, and the incentives to do this have not been great, and as a result, we have much less information than we probably should have about the effectiveness of various treatments that are proposed than we should have had by this time. In part, also, I think that's been driven by this groupthink that you mentioned that has decided that there's only a small set of things that are going to work even before any of the evidence has been evaluated. I think all of that is to be regretted. I think we have to go back to the principles we know about how sound science works. We have to look at you have to do control groups, you have to do studies, but you have to have the incentives to run those studies or else they're not going to get done.
So, Senator Hawley, are you there? But we'll check with his staff. One thing I think we lose in these discussions about observational versus random control studies is the difference between a pandemic situation and a non-pandemic situation. When you've got these off-the-shelf drugs that have been prescribed safely for decades, it's kind of like, why not give it a shot? I mean, it should be a completely different mindset, and we just went the other way. So do we have Senator Hawley? Thanks for joining the hearing. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for holding this hearing. Dr. Bhattacharya, if I could, first of all, am I pronouncing your name right? Is it Bhattacharya?
Just fine, thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's very indulgent of you. I want to ask you about some of the points that you made in your written testimony. which I thought were quite striking, about the challenges of mitigation strategies, particularly mitigation strategies that involve lockdowns, full lockdowns, which of course we experienced in virtually every part of the country, certainly in my home state, earlier this year, and that many have been advocating as a mitigation strategy again now. You write about the data that the consequences of social isolation and a deteriorating mental health that is associated with these lockdowns. I was particularly struck by the CDC data that you cite that says, let me get this right, that 1 in 4 young adults seriously considered suicide this past June when much of the country was locked down. That's a really stunning number. And these impacts that you talk about in your testimony are really stunning. So can you speak to the challenges that maybe young people in particular, but all Americans face from lockdowns as a mitigation strategy?
I think lockdowns as a mitigation strategy are a failure of policy imagination, and they have had absolutely devastating effects. Humans are not meant to live in isolation, and that's the main focus of the lockdown strategies. Now, I think there are some folks who are at high risk from this disease. As I said, older people, some people with chronic conditions. And so, for instance, 40% of deaths have happened in nursing homes. There, we actually do need to do some sort of isolation, but we have to be careful there as well. There's been a 20% increase in dementia-related deaths in nursing homes, apart from COVID. There's the key failure, I think, is a failure of public health to recognize that there's dangers other than COVID. Heart disease, the psychological distress to young people is devastating. We basically made them feel guilty for doing normal young people things. And as a result, it's had, as you can see, 1 in 4 seriously considered suicide. That number is absolutely shocking. I mean, I think it should shock the imagination of everyone listening into thinking creatively about policy alternatives to the lockdown. The lockdown should be a very, very last-ditch effort, not the thing that we decide is we should do all the time.
I noticed that now even the World Health Organization, which I have to say is a body in which I place very little trust, and for which, given its conduct in this pandemic, I have very little respect. But nonetheless, even the WHO, I believe, has now said that mass lockdowns as a mitigation strategy they don't recommend them. I mean, quite the contrary. That they think the consequences, some of which you've just outlined from these lockdowns, are devastating.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an estimate that the UN put out in April, actually, I think, saying that there were 130 million people at risk of starvation as a consequence of the economic damage from the epidemic. I mean, these are lives. 130 million. I mean, that's 2 orders of magnitude more than the number of people who have died from COVID-19. And to not account for that in our policy response, I think is utterly irresponsible.
Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the other healthcare effects associated with lockdowns and decisions to cancel elective surgeries? I know in my home state of Missouri, many hospitals canceled elective surgeries back in the spring, trying to prepare based on the data at the time for what they thought would be an absolutely massive surge. And even now, as we're seeing cases rising quite significantly across the country, and again in my home state, a number of hospitals, as a precaution, have curbed elective surgeries and in some cases delay them, which I totally understand. But help us speak to, if you could, the issues that come with the problem of deferred health care. And when you have, again, especially in a lockdown situation, when you have many tens of thousands of Americans, millions of Americans, maybe deferring what would otherwise be fairly routine healthcare procedures, healthcare visits. What is the cumulative effect of that over weeks and months as it builds up?
We're going to be paying the toll for that for a very long time. Just to take one example that's striking to me, mammograms to check for breast cancer declined by, I think, something over 80% nationwide. What's the consequence of that? Many women who would have been diagnosed with earlier stage breast cancers now will come in with late stage breast cancers in next year. We've actually had made a lot of progress in reversing mortality for breast cancer and other cancers in the last decade. That's going to get reversed with 100% certainty as basic preventative measures, colonoscopies, mammography, have gone by the wayside because of COVID. I mean, I think I mean, I should be clear, because of the COVID lockdowns. I think that the public health should think about all of health, not simply one disease. Public health is not just about infection control. I think that's been a major mistake that we've made all through this pandemic.
Very good. Thank you for that. Dr. Kory, could I just ask you a question or two about social media? You wrote in your testimony, I noticed, that one of the barriers to using already existing therapeutics, whatever they may be, it's an array of them, has been social media. And you say that your pages in particular have been repeatedly blocked on Facebook. I wonder if you could just elaborate on your experience with Facebook or any other social media on this topic.
Yeah. You know, I want to try to be respectful, because I think the intention is correct. The execution is unfortunately damaging, which is my guess at what the social media outlets, in particular it's Facebook, is that they want to cut down on misinformation, right? Which is many doctors are out there claiming X, Y, and Z work in this disease. The challenge is you're also silencing those of us who are expert, reasoned, researched, and extremely knowledgeable. And so my group, our Facebook page, and again, I repeat, we are some of the most highly published physicians in our specialty. We've spent, decades in academic medicine. We're not just some random doctor, but our group, every time we mention ivermectin, we've been put in Facebook jail. Currently, as of this moment, our Facebook page is shut down to the point where we cannot post anything. And we've asked the senator for help in that, because we're trying to disseminate expert opinion, heavily researched insights into the therapeutics of this disease, and we are unable to do that on social media.
And what reason, Dr. Kory, what reason have they given, if any, for putting you in Facebook jail?
I don't know that we've gotten specific reasons, but the best that we can tell is that we were mentioning ivermectin. So any claims to a simple solution, and by the way, I'm going to stand by my professional reputation, my decades in medicine, and I'm going to tell you that I believe, not only I believe, but my group of doctors, and there's at least 9 of us who co-authored this manuscript, we are telling the world this is the solution to COVID-19 and it can be implemented rapidly. However, social media does not want to hear that from doctors. And I don't blame them, because otherwise you're going to have doctors coming along and saying, soda water, or this is the next solution. So I understand the intent. However, I just wish some credibility would be applied to us, and I don't know how to solve that answer, because I do think misinformation is a problem. It is a deep and significant problem in this pandemic. However, we are not propagators of misinformation.
Is Facebook staffed with expert epidemiologists and infectious disease researchers, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge, certainly not.
No. I mean, should Facebook be the arbiter of what counts as medical research, in your opinion?
Of course, I don't think that they should be the arbiters, but I'm trying to be fair, and I do think their intent is to protect people from misinformation. However, they are also blocking good information. It's a very hard filter to put on, and I can understand their challenge. I just wish they did better at it.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Kory, thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing that. Unfortunately, this is a pattern that we see with Facebook and the other social media giants, which have now decided that they will be the arbiters of all information, news, journalism, and the rest in the United States, and that they will determine what counts as accurate, reliable news, research, and everything else, despite usually having zero expertise in any of these areas. And by the way, with zero desire for the American public that they should be deciding what we read, what we consume, what we learn about, what we share. It's really unbelievable. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this hearing.
Well, thank you, Senator Hawley, for participating. I want to quick go to Dr. Rajter, who's treated patients both in hospital and also as an outpatient. Just to describe in human terms what happens to a COVID patient, I think it is one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the disease that, and quite honestly, it's one of the reasons I know people that will not get tested, because they don't want to become a COVID patient because they don't want to be separated from their family. But can you just describe what's happened and and how people are dying alone. And
So
does that continue to be necessary? But just describe what happens when you have somebody go into the hospital. Take it from there.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. So let me talk about a specific patient, a specific example, because that's very vivid in my mind.
And talk as loud as you can.
This is a lady that came in. She was in her 50s, no significant medical problems. I believe she had slight hypertension and diabetes, but everything was very well controlled. The lady was initially diagnosed with COVID when she presented and was on room air. Within a few hours, she ended up on 2 liters worth of oxygen, and that's the point at which I got consulted to help with her management. Over the course of the next 24 hours, this lady went from 2 liters of oxygen all the way up to 50% of oxygen. That is a very, very rapid decline. At the time, the hospital was in lockdown, meaning there were no visitors allowed into the hospital. So this lady knew that things were going very badly for her. The medical staff was limiting access to the rooms because we had very limited PPE supplies. So there she was with a disease that she was well aware of, was quite critical, with no family at bedside, very limited interaction with healthcare workers or nurses entering that room. And I was there looking at her. I'm like, this is bad news. Based on my experience, this lady would be facing near certain intubation. And back in April, intubation meant a 90% chance of dying. So I call her son up and get an iPad into the room so they can FaceTime and have a discussion. And that's the point at which the son broke down in tears. He's like, doctor, you got to do something for her. You got to. Doctors always have something they can do. I'm like, sir, with all due respect, I have nothing else to offer. Luckily, my wife, who is also a doctor, Dr. Sapelowitz-Rajter, had just read the article about Dr. Wagstaff in Australia the day before. And, as the patient's family was pleading with me, I'm like, you know what? We have this one hope. I don't know what to do with this. There is no clinical data. The dosing in that trial is not something I can administer to humans. It's toxic. And then it was like, but it has other indications, right? I'm like, yes, there is. And then we started talking about other indications. They said, you know what? Give it a shot. Try. Please, I beg of you, try. So I got informed consent from him, informed consent from her, administered the drug, and allowed to establish that connectivity between that family. Luckily, that lady did very well. She did not get intubated. She went up to 90% oxygen, but subsequently improved and was discharged to home maybe a week later. But you see that social isolation where those people are away from family. And even today, visitors are allowed back into the hospital, but they are not allowed into the COVID rooms. That means that those patients are away from family, and because of all the measures that healthcare workers need to take, even now we still have a policy of limiting entry into the room. For example, the nurse will group all the lab draws and all the medications and try to enter the room maybe 3 or 4 times a day at most. The residents, which are part of the institution, are asked not to enter the room. There's going to be 1 or 2 physicians that are going to do the physical exam, which is taken over by the other physicians. Usually, I'm one of those physicians that has to enter the room on all these patients and expose myself. But once again, it is very, very isolating for these people. We now know that besides all the medical problems that COVID causes, the kidney problems, the heart problem, the lung problems, we also know that it creates tremendous amount of problems with mental status. These people, their mind is not quite right. And we have seen this, a tremendous amount of anxiety. So yes, it has been emotionally draining, both for the patients, their families, and frankly, for healthcare workers as myself. I have a young family, I have a young wife and children. And at the end of the day, I want to go home and be safe. And that's why I have become such a major proponent of early treatment, because with early treatment, I will not expose the healthcare workers, including myself and my staff, unnecessarily to these people now admitted to the hospital with more advanced disease. And that's why I feel it's so critical to have that early intervention, because we do know that treatment works much better earlier on than later on. And even later on, you can see on my data that I published, the results are quite staggering.
So, Dr. Rajter, you just made a pretty convincing case from my standpoint of why we should concentrate on early treatments, because if we can, we avoid that type of human toll. Dr. Orient, one of the reasons I got in contact with you, became aware of you, was through Dr. Lee Vliet, who was advocating early treatment, in particular with hydroxychloroquine. And your organization allowed me to get, I think it's like 1,300 or 1,700 doctors very quickly signing a letter that we sent to the President of the United States encouraging, doing something to allow doctors to have access to these types of drugs, to use their off-label prescription rights. But I think one of the things that always impressed me about your organization, AAPS, was its pretty simple mission statement. So can you first describe that, then also what you're hearing from that network of doctors that have the courage and compassion to treat patients early, and basically answer my question that I asked Dr. Rajter about, what is happening to these COVID patients, and is there a better approach?
Well, AAPS was founded in 1943 to preserve private medicine, and that means the physician is working for the good of his patients, like it says in the Oath of Hippocrates, not for the good of the organization or society or the political party or the advancement of science, but each individual patient is the doctor's first priority. And the doctor has to have the authority to go along with his responsibility to that patient, to look into the best methods, to communicate with his colleagues. And sometimes, or a lot of times, you just have to guess about what's the best thing to do for your patient and to keep a careful watch on what works best. We found that physicians in independent practice are able to do this. But once a doctor has an employer, or he has a managed care plan where he's restricted to what's on the drop-down menu, then his hands are really tied. If the NIH is the authority that their employer respects, then if he goes outside those rules, no matter how much his patient needs it, he's putting his life at risk, and it's becoming more and more. We used to worry about malpractice liability, but that's a minor thing compared with being peer-reviewed by your hospital in a way just to get rid of you that destroys your whole career forever, or of being before the licensure board because you deviated from the standard of care, which used to be determined by what doctors in a similar situation, rational, well-trained people would do, but now is dictated more and more by single authorities from on high whose opinions keep just getting carried on along, like the AMA or the Arizona Medical Association. I'm learning about ivermectin here. The Arizona Medical Association, our county medical society, the AMA will say nothing about this. You ask about, well, what are doctors doing? And the answer is, well, nothing that's not recommended by the FDA. So for a patient to have an independent doctor who is not under quite so much severe restrictions on what he can do is extremely important. I mean, occasionally a patient will tell me, well, I begged and pleaded with the hospital to do this for my person who was my patient, my husband who was dying. Please, will you give him some intravenous vitamin C? And sometimes the patient's suggestion works. I mean, it doesn't always, but if the doctor's afraid that he dare not do something that's even very safe, or that's even being clinically trialed, or has been reported in the literature, even if a long time ago, that he will lose his job, then he has every incentive to say, well, there's nothing more that I can do. So keeping this option open for patients is extremely important.
Thank you, Dr. Orient. I championed right to try, and Dr. Rajter, basically that's what you practiced in. I mean, you had a patient there, you had to do something with that patient, and the patient's son begged you to do something, and you did something. I think that is exactly your right, and we certainly are seeing a different type of medical establishment where we have fewer doctors practicing medicine and more associated with these hospitals where they follow protocols, which makes perfect sense. But in a pandemic, you have to think outside the box. You have to do other things. Dr. Balboni, I want to ask you, because I thought our phone conversation on Sunday was pretty interesting. You've been in the FDA. You've been a physician in Department of Defense. You've been in government, but now you're on the outside. I really want to ask you two questions. One, can you describe why government doesn't have the incentive to run these trials? We know the private sector doesn't. They cost millions and millions of dollars. And if it's a generic drug, there's no incentive other than in government. And it should be the NIH or the CDC, the FDA, that advocates for all citizens, for all patients, regardless of the financial incentive, but to look at repurposing drugs. Can you describe why that did not occur? Because one of the things we talked about is we had these drugs in our toolkit for a pandemic. I think Dr. Fauci talked about hydroxychloroquine. The drug that your company is trying to go through trial now, that was kind of in the toolkit. It was designed for pandemics, and all of a sudden we hit COVID. It's like that toolbox drawer was shut and locked, and we ignored it. So can you just kind of describe that process and the lack of incentives?
Sure, and great question, and I'll try and do so with the utmost respect for my colleagues and former colleagues in government, because I think at the end of the day, people are trying to do the right thing, and I have to say that. And sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. And to your question about why, we're working on favipiravir. I first saw that as part of the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And it showed an effect in treating Ebola, and then everyone kind of forgot about it. And the pressure to move quickly went away. It's approved for pandemic flu in Japan. It's approved for COVID-19 in India and Russia. It's likely to be approved in Japan for COVID-19 imminently. The FDA is not moving as quickly, although we're having very fruitful discussions with them. I think that we are treating, unfortunately, many of these products as if they were for chronic diseases. And that may work well in a non-pandemic situation. And that's the structure of these organizations is to review thoughtfully and take the time to look at all the data. And again, I'm not suggesting we don't do that. But in addition to that, we have to push these agencies. There has to be a forcing function for change. And when under stress, I think they fall back on what they know, which is reviewing and approving drugs like cardiovascular drugs, which they can take more time with. So I think there needs to be both a forcing function for supporting their efforts to move outside of what is tried and true in their review process. And I think you as a committee and as politicians have your hands on that lever. Whether it's policy or law, there needs to be a forcing function to move them out of the ways that they do things, which again work in a non-pandemic situation. And I would point to two things, Senator. Public Law 11592. I worked on that when I was inside the DoD. That was a law signed into effect in 2017, which mandates that the DoD and FDA hold discussions and talks around regulated products that are of particular interest to the warfighter. And it puts them on an accelerated approval track. It doesn't cut corners, but it allows the regulators to devote resources to those kinds of accelerated discussions. I would also point to a very recent development, and politics notwithstanding, it shouldn't matter, a very pragmatic approach to doing the same kind of work as the RESULT Act submitted by Senators Cruz and Lee. Without having done, I did some reading of that, and it seems like a very pragmatic approach to push and force some change on the regulatory agencies to move things along more quickly. I have to say, and the last thing I'll say here is I received 17 emails over the weekend and calls requesting compassionate use and single-use INDs for favipiravir. In the middle of running randomized controlled trials, I can't possibly entertain all of those, My colleagues, many of whom you've heard today, are treating those patients. I can't entertain all of those compassionate use single patient INDs. So we have to move the regulators outside of their comfort zone, work with them to develop new policies. And I'm hopeful that you and your colleagues, with your hands on those levers, can force that policy and get them out of what they know and start thinking a bit creatively in the middle of a pandemic.
And I'm quite sure that the Results Act, I think I'm a co-sponsor, that ties in very nicely with Right to Try. That allows patients and doctors to use a drug that's approved by another body, let's say whatever the FDA equivalent is for the EU, correct?
That's right. So drugs that are approved in other well-established jurisdictions like Europe or Canada or Japan, for example, it would move the agency, the FDA, to review and treat as equivalent that review and approval, and so it would greatly speed the process of getting drugs available.
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of allowing doctors to be doctors and allowing patients to make these decisions because it's their lives or it's their families' lives. Talked about other world bodies or other things that are happening globally. In our last hearing, Dr. McCullough pointed out that the death rate in India is about 95 per million. In the U.S. and other advanced nations, it's closer to 800 per million. I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but are you aware of us actually studying what these other countries are doing? One thing I've been struck is I've been kind of at the tip of the spear here, so I get a lot of information. I'm not a doctor, but it's an awful lot of interesting information. And one of the things that I have found out or heard is some of these less developed countries that just don't have the type of money to throw it at a medical system like the U.S., all they have are these cheap generic drugs, are using them and doing quite well. Does anybody have some expertise to kind of speak to that? Dr. Bhattacharya.
Senator, if I can have an opportunity after Dr.
Sure.
Bhattacharya.
Sure. So I think I've been reading the scientific evidence on this. There's a debate going on about what exactly is the difference. So part of the difference is that they have a younger population. So for instance, the low rate of mortality in Africa for COVID is almost certainly it partly due to that because it's so relatively few elderly. But also, I agree with you. The use of other medications that appear promising are certainly going to end up, I think, could play a role in explaining why places like India, places like countries in Africa have done better. But there's another explanation that a couple of other explanations that I've heard in the scientific literature. Again, this is still all being sorted out. Is the prevalence of cheap vaccinations, like there's a vaccination called BCG vaccination, which apparently has played some role. At least that's the hypothesis that people put forward, and there's some evidence in favor of that in preventing bad outcomes from the disease and actually from the disease at all. And the other hypothesis I've heard is the prevalence of pre-existing other of immunity based on cross-reactive protection from other coronavirus infections, right? So there's higher rates of that in some of in many poorer countries. So I think all of those, we're going to sort out how much each of those explanations end up playing a role. I don't think we yet have a definitive answer, but I think that plus things that we haven't thought of yet are going to end up playing an important role in understanding of this. But notice I didn't say lockdowns, because in many of those places, lockdowns are not actually feasible as a long-term outcome, and have probably not played a role in explaining why they've done better. Lockdowns are sort of a luxury of the rich, and a very expensive one at that.
Dr. Kory?
Yes. So, Senator, my organization, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, we've worked with a number of analysts. And two analysts that are part of our organization have been doing numerous epidemiologic analyses throughout the pandemic. Their data, which again, I have to say, is free to share. We can share with the NIH, the FDA, so they can verify and validate the data. But if I could go through that data very briefly right now, I'd appreciate it. I brought slides. I will go through them very quickly. Okay. They are visual and easy to understand.
Do we have slides available on? Is this the one on Peru?
So, yes, and let's start with that because Dr. Bhattacharya just mentioned something, is that one hypothesis for why we're seeing lower rates is that potentially they're younger populations. I want to show data to show that that's not true in these regions.
Is this the right slide?
Yes. Number one, this is only in patients over 60. We know the mortality rates in patients over 60. They are fundamentally different than in younger patients. When you only look at patients over 60 and you look at this slide, this is in the 8 regions of Peru, 8 states in Peru that initiated ivermectin distribution campaigns throughout their population. If you look at each graph, the shaded area to the left of the graph is before the ivermectin distribution. To the right of that shaded area is after they initiated ivermectin distribution campaigns. In each of the 8 states, you see what we call a temporally associated reduction. There's a peak in deaths, a peak in case counts, and a peak in case fatality rates, which rapidly decrease to pre-pandemic levels. This is powerful, powerful data. If you could go to the next slide. The next slide, I believe if you could show me, that's actually a skip, but I'll say this has been replayed. We have data from many, many countries. On my website, our analysts have numerous examples. This is one in Paraguay. There was a state in Paraguay called Alto Paraná. The governor there got COVID. His brother got COVID. They took ivermectin and felt immediately better, and so they concluded that ivermectin was an effective treatment. I'm not saying that's how we determine treatments, but that's what they did. The governor did something really dramatic. He immediately began what he called a deworming campaign throughout his state because he didn't want to go against the federal health ministry, which was against ivermectin. In his state, he began to distribute ivermectin to the population. If you look at that graph,
that's the
case
blue
counts
line.
and deaths peak and they rapidly decrease. A month and a half later, he found almost no cases in the hospitals. That was in Paraguay. If you can go to another slide, I can show. Are there any more slides that you have?
This is the one.
Yeah, this
in
is
Mexico.
in Mexico. So this is deaths in Mexico, and the left side of the graph is before August 1st, and the right is after. The green shaded state is the state of Chiapas in Mexico, in southern Mexico. That state, alone amongst all the states in Mexico, decided to incorporate ivermectin in its treatment protocols. And if you look, the case counts, and these are widely available and globally used databases of case counts and deaths, you can see the deaths plummeted. While in all the surrounding regions in Mexico, the deaths either decreased only slightly or in the majority they increased. So you are seeing this play out on population-wide basis in many regions of the world. If there's another slide, please advance. Because your question, and so here, going back to Peru, if you look at the blue lines and graphs, those are those 8 states that I presented whose regional health ministries decided to widely distribute ivermectin. The red bars refer to Lima, the biggest city in Peru. Guess what happened in Lima? The health ministry of Lima did not employ ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. And if you can see, throughout the summer and throughout this pandemic, the case counts rapidly rise and remain high and only recently have come down, but they're nowhere near the regions in which ivermectin was widely used. We have this data. It's showing that we have an effective treatment against this pandemic. I cannot overemphasize that.
Okay, thank you. So I think I've got one question for Dr. Oskoui, and then what I will offer is all of you an opportunity, couple minutes, try and keep a couple minutes of just something that you still want to say that you haven't had an opportunity to do so. Dr. Oskoui, I've got a couple questions for you. First of all, on asymptomatic spread, I think I just heard that we have a 180-degree turn on that, where somebody announced that they really don't believe that asymptomatic spread is that big a deal. And we were earlier told that is one of the biggest problems with COVID is people that don't even know they have the illnesses are walking around there spreading it. Can you discuss what you believe is the current science on that?
Well, I think the current science, and there's a large population-based study out of China that suggests that asymptomatic spread is extremely uncommon. I think one of the reasons why literature has not clearly supported masking, and I'll review that in my final comments as a significant preventative, is that I think that early on we got it wrong as to what is the predominant mechanism of spread. I believe what the Oxford University white paper by Thomas Jefferson believes, in which I provided to Ms. Kildea, the clerk of this committee, that I think that oral fecal transmission, much like norovirus and polio, is a predominant mechanism of spread, and that's one of the reasons why masking doesn't work and why asymptomatic spread isn't predominant. So I think that makes much more sense. The white paper is provided to Ms. Kildea. I provide it to your aid, and I hope it will be disseminated among members of the committee. But I think the science behind that paper, Tom Jefferson and the rest of the Oxford group for the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, is actually pretty compelling. We've had that since March. I think the ramifications of that are that aggressive use of chlorine-based cleaners and other things would really be very helpful in transmission and really need to be effectively promulgated.
So can you, and again, this isn't, I'm not a doctor, this isn't a, medical class here, but can you just describe the biology in terms of COVID and why whether it's ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine with zinc, whether it's favipiravir, I'm probably mispronounced that, but I'm actually doing better than I thought. Can you describe in layman's terms how that might work? Can you lay this out simply enough, or is it just a bad question?
It's rather complicated to do so in a short period. There was a pangolin tissue model that a number of Chinese scientists published about that I read referenced in Journal of Medical Virology that showed that three drugs, a drug similar to ivermectin, a drug similar to hydroxychloroquine, actually had local effects. Hydroxychloroquine's mechanism is probably multifactorial. It prevents viral autophagy. It also is an anti-inflammatory and has some benefits there. There's also ivermectin has some important effects as well. But there is strong basic science in addition to the clinical studies that I presented to your clerk and which Dr. Kory has referenced that suggest mechanisms for significant efficacy. I'll provide that separately and as an addendum to my testimony.
But is it safe to say that all these, off-the-shelf generic drugs, in some way, shape, or form, they limit or halt the viral replication? Is that the mechanism going on?
We've known since 2005 that zinc was an effective inhibitor of furan cleavage, an important mechanism that makes these viruses more virulent. That's something that our Fort Detrick colleagues published and then didn't do much with. But there's good literature that suggests that zinc itself is very effective. I personally recommend to my patients that all of them take 50 milligrams of chelated zinc a day if they can tolerate the dyspepsia, and to keep their vitamin D levels over 30. There's significant data, a very nice study in the U.S., large study, as well as one out of Israel, that if one keeps one's vitamin D3 level over 30, that one cuts the relative risk of getting COVID by 50 to 55%. So it's a simple public health measure that could be undertaken easily.
So let me ask, of all these things that people have talked about, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin C, quercetin, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, favipiravir. Are there any real dangers? I did talk to Dr. Balboni on favipiravir for, certainly you shouldn't give it to women that are pregnant. But these other ones, how safe are they? Is there really any danger at prescribing these at the proper levels?
The short answer.
In other words, to give it a shot. As opposed to doing nothing, which is what NIH guidelines is right now. Is there? Go ahead.
The short answer, I think, is there is really trivial, if any, risk at all. The reality is that our academic colleagues who have not discussed vitamin D and some of these other interventions aren't, but it need not be a binary choice, obviously. We don't have to decide hydroxychloroquine versus remdesivir versus vaccines. We need all hands on deck. What I would say is that there's some nuanced arguments about quercetin. I think the data about vitamin D toxicity is trivial, and really the real problem is vitamin D deficiency. Dr. Kory in his testimony mentioned that two groups in the United States have been hardest hit, African Americans and Hispanics. African Americans, 81% of African Americans in the United States suffer from vitamin D deficiency, 60% of Hispanics, 40% of Caucasians. Nursing home patients are notorious for being vitamin D deficient. Military service members also are known to be vitamin D deficient. You'd think they were sunning themselves on these aircraft carriers, but obviously quite the contrary. I think that we should follow the example of the National Health Service in the UK and Scotland, which is currently distributing vitamin D supplements to their elderly. They've been doing that for a couple weeks now. Why we are not pressing this simple point while we go over these other issues fails to meet my level of understanding.
Okay,
Senator, can I answer
go
your
ahead,
question?
Dr. Kory.
So you've said repeatedly, and you and I have a strong kinship on that approach, which is, does it hurt to try? So what are the risks of treatment with these agents? And I'll tell you, in medicine, as a physician, every decision I make therapeutically, it involves exactly that question, which is a risk-benefit analysis. And so if the therapy I have is either low cost, low resource, or extremely safe, and its potential for benefit is high, it would win the risk-benefit analysis, and you should be given. And I think that is what you've been arguing. And I tell you, with these agents, the answer is unequivocally yes. When you look at the mortality and morbidity of this disease, which is unparalleled, we are seeing countless deaths, and it's horrific the way they're dying. And you look at these safe and low-cost agents, it seems like a no-brainer that you should try it. And here's the thing about ivermectin. Going back to ivermectin, because you know that is my message today, that it is the cure for this cancer.
By the way, you support ivermectin, right?
Of course. You're not confused about that, right, Senator? So you have to understand something about ivermectin. 3.7 billion doses have been administered since it was first developed in 1987. 3.7 billion. Something like over 60% of sub-Saharan Africa takes it on a yearly basis. It has an unparalleled safety profile with almost no side effects. The only side effects that have been attributed to it are those that are considered to be part of the diseases they treat, which is the ridding of the parasites. And so given the mountain of evidence that I've presented, as well as the safety profile on a risk-benefit therapeutic analysis, you cannot come up with a credible argument to not give it.
Well, hydroxychloroquine, I think in testimony, Dr. Risch talked about tens of billions of doses of that. I know in the U.S. because I was concerned when we first started talking about that, it was a legitimate concern. If everybody started using that in the U.S. or worldwide as a prophylaxis, you couldn't produce enough, and so people with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis may not get it. So that would be a legitimate concern and maybe required government intervention to ration. Okay, but you know what I thought was interesting about it is I kind of lost my train of thought. I'll move on. Let's go to the. My final round of questioning. We'll start with Dr. Bhattacharya. And by the way, real quick, because I want to ask you, I thought in your testimony two things were very stark. And now you mentioned this with Senator Hawley. The 130 million people that the UN study showed were going to starve to death because of the economic devastation of the shutdowns, that now the World Health Organization says we shouldn't be shutting down. And yet, there's so many governors that are still pursuing that path. The other one was, and this is, I don't think it was in your testimony, I saw this in another writing. I've certainly been following, and I've actually, in a couple op-eds, talked about the case fatality rate versus the infection fatality rate. I've been monitoring what the estimate is, the prediction is from Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. For months now, they've been predicting the infection fatality rate is going to be somewhere between 0.1 and 0.4. I think now it's 0.1 and 0.35. You talked about in an article about these seroprevalence studies, 82 of them now are kind of pointing to a 0.2% infection fatality rate. Seasonal flu, and I've printed this out from the CDC website, a bad year is about 0.18. So just a little under that. Again, I'm not downplaying COVID. As Senator Paul talked about, people he knows, as those of you who've treated, it's a deadly disease, and particularly for over 70, 5% of the people with COVID die from it, okay, or with it. So I'm not downplaying this, but I think you have to look at those numbers and ask, what have we done, and what is the human toll of our actions on a disease that long-term it looks like it's certainly worse than the flu, but is it that much worse to cause that much economic devastation with that severe human toll? 130 million people starving, and of course we heard all the other follow-ons. But anyway, Dr. Bhattacharya, if you have your closing thoughts.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and thank you for that lead up. I mean, I think it is worse than the flu, but it has very different properties than the flu. Older people have a much higher rate of death from this than younger people, which is different. I mean, the flu also has that pattern, but not quite so pronounced. That means that we should have a different, but the most striking difference in how we dealt with the flu versus how we deal with this is not actually in the treatments and all that. I mean, there's obviously vaccines and other things that's different. But the most striking thing is that in the case of the flu, we do not induce panic. And in this case, we have. Panic has been part of the policy, has been part of the lockdown. I think has caused enormous harm. It's a violation of all that I've ever learned about standard public health practice, which is generally to reassure the public, provide good information, and seek to develop good treatments and preventative activities. Instead, we've just panicked the public. Let me close by just remarking on how civil and interesting this conversation has been. You've heard disagreement a little bit among us, but we've been talking about hypotheses on complicated issues. And I've learned from the panel. I think this kind of conversation ought to be the standard, instead of this sort of closed mind, like we heard from the ranking member, sort of a closed-minded decision that experts have decided what the truth is, and we just stop conversation. I think so. Let me just note that. And the second thing I want to end with is. We talked about how should we do evaluation in the midst of a pandemic versus in the midst of normal times. I mean, I think there's always this trade-off of risk and reward in this when we're deciding whether a treatment works, and we're telling patients or public health authorities that we should adopt this or that thing. We want to have the best possible information available. At the same time, even outside of a pandemic, if you're really sick, and there's not a good treatment for you, you would like to be able to see things that generally you wouldn't use, because the reward from the potential reward from it working is so great, and really there's no cost, much less cost, because you're at great risk already. I think the major problem is the structures we have in place to do this kind of rapid evaluation and develop evidence. They're not a sufficient incentives in place to do this kind of evaluation, as I said in my opening testimony. And I think there's for both economic reasons and sort of government failure reasons that's true. We absolutely have to fix that. We need a system that allows for this kind of conversation, formal conversation with rapid evaluation of using observational data, rapid funding of larger scale studies for the most promising things, to be done sort of all the time, not just during a pandemic. And I hope that the pandemic, one lesson we come out of it is, let's be more humble about the whether expert opinion actually can be correct, and instead be more open to novel ideas, even ones that seem to some part of the experts as not actually going to work. Well, let's try it. Let's do studies around it and then decide, and on that basis make decisions, as opposed to just closing off debate altogether, as we saw sort of the ranking member try to do.
No, listen, it amazes me how these hearings have been attacked. Really how close-minded this has been. How our colleagues have boycotted this. It is pretty amazing to me. Dr. Orient, I actually did remember what I was leading to in terms of talking about hydroxychloroquine. I just wanted to ask, it was originally approved for anti-malarial, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it's never been FDA approved for what it's primarily used for nowadays, because anti-malarial use is small in comparison to its application to rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. Those are off-label applications and it works. And so we're just suggesting, well, maybe it might work for COVID too. Why not give it a shot? But do you have, and by the way, I've got to vote it in about 10 minutes. So if you can kind of stay within that 2-minute constraint, I'd appreciate your closing comments. But Dr. Orient.
That's exactly right, that it is off-label use for many, many things. About hydroxychloroquine, there are graphs of that look quite a bit like the graphs for ivermectin, that when countries like in Brazil, one part of it uses hydroxychloroquine and the other part really forbids it, you see a big difference in the mortality rates. And most impressive probably was in Switzerland, when mortality rate went up when they stopped using it because of the terror provoked by that Lancet study that was withdrawn. And then it came down again when the Swiss went back to using it. So I think both drugs have a lot of potential, and sometimes patients respond better to one than to another. The big difference between India and the United States bears repeating. 10 times higher mortality in the US and Western Europe compared with third world countries. Part of the reason may be the age distribution, but part of it may be sunshine and less vitamin D deficiency in India and Africa. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the poison thing that Dr. Jean made a big deal about in the last hearing, and Dr. McCullough answered it quite competently. But just to reiterate that Dr. Jean was concerned that the rate of Poison Control Center reports for hydroxychloroquine went up, doubled. Actually, it went up from 35 to 76. But if you look at hand sanitizer, there were 33,000 hand sanitizer reports to the Poison Control Center, which was an increase of 73%. And for acetaminophen, which everybody recommends that you take instead of some of the drugs that might help you, there were 50,000 cases of just exposure to that alone, and another 23,000 in combination, and 65 and 42 deaths respectively. But people are terrified of the cardiac effects, even though reviews have shown that hydroxychloroquine may actually protect the heart rather than be a danger to the heart. And if you're worried about QT intervals, you ought to worry about a lot of common antibiotics and antidepressants also, which we don't.
Again,
Other points. One other thing I might mention is just to, somebody mentioned the orophycal transmission, which I think is very interesting, that's been coming to light. Back in the SARS epidemic, there was cases of that broke out in an apartment building. I couldn't figure out why, and it was probably because of the flushing toilets putting aerosols into the ventilation system. Maybe this has a lot to do with it. Maybe instead of putting masks on everybody, we should be putting lids on the toilet or pouring Clorox into it before you flush it. And I think our epidemiologists have not been doing a very good job of figuring out just exactly how does the transmission occur, so that we can be sure that our mitigation methods are targeted to the means. But getting back to all of this, I think doctors need to use their own judgment and look at all of these things.
Yeah, I think I read an article about the high pressure flushes inside hospitals might be a problem. Dr. Balboni, again, a couple minutes, please.
Sure, thank you, and thanks to you for your support. In 17 years in the Army, I've lived by the motto, one team, one fight. At the DoD, everybody became an Ebola scientist or physician. Everybody became a COVID-19 physician at USAMRIID as they tried to fight this. There's an urgent need to develop hybrid trial methodologies, new approaches to public policy, and I think from my perspective, most importantly, to fit the regulatory approaches to the threat that we're faced with, in this case, a pandemic. If we fail to change our approach and develop an appropriate and safe use of these drugs, including oral antiviral therapeutics, we're going to be having this conversation again for COVID-20 or 21 or virus X. It is unfortunate, and I've seen it already. We can't continue to send 170,000 COVID positive patients home with the hope that they'll be okay. It's just not going to work. So we need, in closing, your assistance and the continued leadership of, frankly, this entire committee and the whole of government to finally build this toolbox. And so I thank you for reaching out, and thank you to all of my colleagues here that have testified. And I hope the message has come across.
And I hope they're not vilified for doing so. Dr. Kory.
Yeah, so I'll be brief at your request, Senator. Two things I want to mention. This is not the flu. I've been a doctor for a long time. I will tell you, from the earliest onset in this country in New York, in one major healthcare system that I helped work with. They went from 95 ICU beds in a span of 2.5 weeks to 350 ICU beds. Gastroenterologists were taking care of dying patients on ventilators. We do not do that with the flu. I have done nothing but take care of COVID patients since the beginning. We have ICUs dedicated to COVID patients on ventilators. That is not what happens with the flu. The last thing I want to say is, again, I'm just going to reiterate because repetition is key. The amount of patients in the randomized controlled trials whose results are now available, and again, they've come out recently, they're emerging. I don't want to attack the NIH for getting it wrong. They didn't necessarily get it wrong, they're just not keeping up with the data. My message today is that the recently emerging data has enough randomized controlled trial patients enrolled they exceed the recovery trial, which changed the face of treatment of COVID. If you look at the summation of all those trials, ivermectin has shown itself to be a highly effective preventative and early treatment agent. It needs to be immediately adopted systematically, nationally, and globally, period.
And by the way, I just want to clarify, I am in no way, shape, or form downplaying COVID. I didn't want to get it. I don't want anybody to get it. I understand how serious, and I was just making the data comparison. Dr. Rajter.
Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to participate in these hearings. As a frontline provider, I have been treating COVID pretty much every single day since the onset. I've only had pretty much 7 days off since December 31st. Every other day has been taking care of these COVID patients in the hospital. This is heartbreaking. This is really difficult. Initially, we had to fight to get what I deemed appropriate treatment at the time. Now I have the endorsement of the medical staff at my facility who are using these medications. I have the endorsements of my colleagues who have seen the response of this medication. Ivermectin is effective. It's effective in early disease. It's effective in late disease. It's effective in prophylaxis. It's an oral medication. You do not need to monitor anything. There's hardly any interaction. You can use this medication in just about any condition, with the exception of people on warfarin. It is safe, inexpensive, widely available. Manufacturers are able to ramp up production of this if need be. Besides the US, it's something that could be implemented as a World Health Organization measure. The data is out there. The unfortunate thing is that we need more funding to be able to provide more studies, to look at people that are still naysayers. We need to get people at the regulatory agencies to review the current data, to see how effective this is, to talk to people that have been using this in certain areas. For example, compare the geographic area where I live and work with my colleagues to other areas in Florida. See if it actually makes a difference. Very easy to do. But I implore you, senators, to really help us, frontline providers, to get us the answers we need. I think we have the answers, but to prove it, to make other regulatory agencies come on board. Do not chastise physicians that have been thinking outside of the box, because honestly, the box has failed us. The medications that were promised to be the game changers to date have not done so. Remdesivir, convalescent plasma, to just name a few. We really need to attack this together, and we need to try to save as many people as we can, because I cannot continue to stand by and see hundreds upon hundreds of people die in hospitals, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people dying across the country. This is not sustainable. And there are easy solutions, inexpensive solutions, and it's time for people to start taking a second look at it and finally believing that this data is real, that it works. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this.
Well, Doctor, thank you for being compassionate and for treating patients. And I would argue, yes, money is definitely a problem, but the root cause is closed minds. Dr. Oskoui.
I just want to I want to thank the committee, specifically you, Dr. Paul, and everyone who actually attended this meeting for allowing me to speak. I did want to hit very briefly on a comment that Senator Peters made and then ran out and have a chance to respond. You showed us a New York Times article that quoted me briefly but tremendously out of context about masking. And I want to say the foundation for that was actually an article published in mid-November in the New England Journal of Medicine, run by Mount Sinai at Paris Island with the Marines. And I'm going to read briefly some from my notes. The study found that 16 of the recruits tested positive for COVID-19 upon enrollment within 2 days of arrival, despite them having been quarantined for 4 weeks beforehand. Another 24 tested positive 7 days after their arrival on the base. The study says, and 11 more recruits tested positive on day 14. Just 5 participants reported any symptoms. Another 26 recruits who did not participate in the study tested positive. So despite a hard quarantine, including 2 weeks of supervised confinement and then forced social distancing and mask protocols, you got a higher transmission rate, not a lower one. This is not common sense substantiated by science. This is not a roadmap to success. So to recap, hard supervised quarantines do not work, even when under full-time supervision for 2 weeks at a closed college, followed by 2 more weeks of self-quarantine. Quarantines are ineffective. Masks do not work. We've done that actually for 40 years. Even when a military-supervised boot camp environment with enforced mask wearing, they were ineffective. Social distancing doesn't work. Even when enforced by the military in boot camp with a 6-foot separation is worthless to prevent infection. I think, in other words, all the claims of so-called interventions and mitigations, such as referred to by the minority ranking leader, do not work when tested under the most favorable set of conditions where compliance is monitored and reinforced by Marine boot camp instructors. That's the end, I think, of the discussion on these matters. And to paraphrase the New York Times, that's the settled science. In reality. The second thing I would refer to is Dr. Bhattacharya's comment about lockdowns. I absolutely concur with him that lockdowns are inappropriate. There's one time that we've done lockdowns previously like this, and that was in Mexico in 2009. They abandoned them within a month because they caused both economic and medical devastation. Lockdowns don't make scientific sense. I believe they go against the WHO's 2019 pandemic guidelines, and as we've seen, it has thrown tens of millions of Americans out of work and have devastated this economy. To further continue it, I think, does not make either military, scientific, or economic sense. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And again, it seems like we have this pandemic playbook that we just threw out the window. And as I said before, I think the root cause of our problem is just closed minds.
Yeah.
I mean, people always preach at me like, follow the science. I think I do. I've got a very open mind. I realize that the term settled science is a very unscientific term.
It is.
We practice medicine. We keep advancing it, but you only advance it if you have an open mind. I'll never forget, in my previous life, I used to listen to a radio talk show, medical doctor, Dr. Dean Adele. And so many times he would say, when you hear hoof prints, think horses, not zebras.
Sure.
I think what has happened here is the people in the agencies, that they're all thinking zebras. They're all looking for the silver bullet solution, the exotic new biologic medicine, the perfect vaccine, when we've got a herd of horses that are just there, plow horses that can be used, and they're safe and they're cheap, and they just might be incredibly effective, as Dr. Kory's talking about ivermectin, and others have argued on hydroxychloroquine and others. Why don't we look at the herd of horses?
Senator,
tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives because we took the eye off the ball. We refused to look at the obvious and try and embrace what would have been the dream solution, something available, something cheap, something that would work. Why didn't we give it a shot? That to me is the question of this hearing, and I really have to go vote. So I've got to close out the hearing. This hearing record will remain open for 15 days until December 23rd at 5 p.m. for submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.